Please welcome to the stage Bill Bishop, publisher of Sinocism China newsletter, Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair of CSIS, and Chair of Modern and Contemporary Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Georgetown University, Deborah Lehr, CEO of Basilinna, and Jonathan Woetzel, Director of the McKinsey Global Institute. To lead the conversation, please welcome back James Fallows.
Greetings, hello again, and I'm glad to see all my China comrades here. I'm not going to waste any of our time or use any of our time telling you about the background of these four people, but from a point of view of somebody trying to learn about China, this is an ideal lineup. The question everybody in China is always asking himself or herself is, what on earth is going on? And we're going to try to explore different aspects of that short-term, long-term, economic, political, social relationships with the United States. And so who's been most recent? Deborah, were you most recently in China? How recently have you been there?
I got back on Friday.
Okay, so you're going to be the lead-off. I'm going to ask all four of you to give just a minute or so summary of what you think is important to understand about the dynamics in China right now. Is it a sense of economic panic? Is it a sense of political chaos? What's the main message you give to people what's going on in China right now?
Well, we had the great fortune to meet with all of the top economic leaders, and including the president, while we were there. And I would say that it isn't a sense of economic chaos. In fact, I think quite the opposite. There's a different perception here of what's happening with the economy than there. They feel that they have a sense that they are at the bottom of what has been a dip, and that looking ahead, the cliff is a little far away. They can manage it if they can get the issues right. The challenge is that the economic decisions are not being led by economic policymakers, but they're being led by and made by a small group of political people around the president. It may sound a little familiar to another situation. And he's consulting with that small group, or he's being influenced by that small group, and a lot of the major decisions that they have to make about the economy, whether it's overcapacity, whether it's some of the environmental issues, and the direction of whether it's making fiscal decisions about rebalancing the economy or not, are being made by a bunch of people who don't necessarily understand the economic implications.
Great. Thank you. So Jonathan, when have you come here from Shanghai?
What day is today?
Okay, so you also are recently off the boat, and all of our guests here have written excellent works. No Ordinary Disruption, which is Jonathan's book, is really valuable. What is the message you tell to people outside China about the lens through which they should see what's happening economically and politically now?
Well, I think it's, first of all, don't bet against China in the medium term, that this has been a remarkable run, and it's a sustaining one, and there are really long-term underlying trends, urbanization and technology being disseminated rapidly across the economy, industrialization. These things don't stop because of one or two incidents. But that said, it's the only way to really understand China is to be in China. I don't believe you can understand China from the outside. So if people are interested, I encourage them to go there. And I met a lovely couple from Colorado Springs who is bringing up their kids. They brought their kids age 8 and 9 to China, and they sat down in the Starbucks and they sort of said, my world has been totally changed as a result of this trip. I now think much more differently in a way which I couldn't have imagined from sitting in Colorado Springs. So my one lens is the China experience lens. Go there and see it.
We'll come back to that. Bill. So Bill lived in Beijing for 10 years, puts out a newsletter called Sinocism, which has a sort of digest everything that's going on. What is the message you find yourself giving as you come back now?
Well, I think to follow on with Deborah's point, the politics are really important to look at, and in many ways right now you have politics in command in China, where you have the Xi, who came in and has launched this corruption crackdown. He's really focused on party building, or rebuilding the party, and reconsolidating Marxist-Leninism on, at least from a I think more than just in name, but really focusing on getting the leadership and the party cadres back into a sort of a very single belief set. On top of that, you have now their political season, which is the run-up to the 19th Party Congress, which will probably be next November, October timeframe. And so there's a lot of jockeying going on about who's going to be in the next. Xi will still be there, we should assume, but who else will be in the next leadership set? So right now, I think when you look at the economy and economic reforms, a lot of things are stalled because they're working through the politics. Again, not necessarily dissimilar from things that happen here, just in a different system. But between now and next November of 2017, I think it would be surprising to see a lot of progress on economic reforms in China.
And so, Michael Green, I invite you to either add on to dissent from, or otherwise build on what you've heard from your colleagues of the main opening premise you'd have for our thinking about China right now.
Well, I just came back from Korea, Japan, and Australia. I'm going to China in a week. And I'm mostly interested in China in Asia. And the takeaway I would have is, while the rest of Asia wants to get rich off of China, they're increasingly anxious. Yeah. Xi Jinping is a strong man abroad, too. He's built islands and militarized them in the South China Sea. He's declared in a variety of speeches that it's time for Asia to be run by Asians, the implicit line being China. And he's realigning the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to move towards force projection. That's completely consistent with what the three previous presenters said, but it's a dimension of China that bears watching as well.
So I have a premise of my own. I'm going to ask each of you to tell me where I'm either wrong or right. And the premise is, from the time of Richard Nixon, the time of Jimmy Carter, for whom I worked when he was normalizing relations with Deng Xiaoping, and through maybe the time of the beginning of the Obama administration, U.S. policy towards China was more or less in a confined band. They were a difficult partner. We disagree with them on many things, but it was much better to have them in the tent than outside the tent. We welcomed their growth, et cetera, even though they were suspicious that we actually did welcome their growth. The hypothesis is whether something basically has changed in the last 2 or 3 years in the political direction of China, in its pace of sort of slow liberalization, of its meshing with rather than differing from the rest of the international system. So are the changes under Xi Jinping, are they one more of the fluctuations we've seen for 40 years, or are they a different trend? Jonathan, I'll start with you.
Well, I think of China as kind of like an adolescent economy, right? Society is sort of a teenager, and anybody who's a parent of teenagers knows that they can do really weird things. They will crash the car, and so what's the appropriate response? So I think that there is the potential for something really dysfunctional to happen in the economy going forward. As Deborah was saying, they're the politicians running it, not the folks who had been running it before. We're very economically minded, and the bad news is that the economics people are not apparently being listened to, which is more troubling. Yeah. But what's the response? I mean, is it to cut things off and stop, or to engage? And I think it's to the mutual benefit and to China's benefit to engage more aggressively and more openly with the United States, and hence this conversation.
And I'm going to skip to Deborah, and coming to Michael last on this for security aspects. So you've been involved in a whole bunch of ways in China, but including with the Paulson Institute. And Hank Paulson has been one of the leading tribunes of the idea that closer and closer interaction is both inevitable and valuable. Has his faith or your faith or the Institute's faith been at all shaken by the changes of the last 2 or 3 years?
I think that Xi Jinping is a global game changer, and that he is fundamentally changing China both inside and outside. And if you look at what he's trying to do, and one of his biggest challenges, he's trying to do it all at once. He's looking at changing China militarily. He's been restructuring the legal system in some ways in a positive way to get rid of the ability of local officials to influence the system. He's changing the economy in one of the world's largest transitions ever, from export and investment-oriented to domestic consumption-oriented. He's changing civil society, he's changing culture, but he's also changing China's foreign affairs policy and military policy. And particularly as Chinese companies go global, they've been very clear that their interests are going to follow globally. So I don't think Hank's view has changed at all. And when he started the Paulson Institute, one of the first speeches that he gave actually was at CSIS. And his recommendation was, building on your premise, that our China policy hasn't changed fundamentally since we first started having one under Nixon. But China is a very, very different place. And under Xi Jinping, whether he's successful or not, will be a very different place than it used to be. And we need to change U.S. policy to adjust accordingly.
Great, and we'll come back to that too. So Bill, I'm going to ask you again about whether things have changed. We've all had the experience in China of the internet is more controlled, our friends are more careful, lawyers are going to jail, publications are being closed down, people are being arrested, et cetera. What is your observation of the sensibility of normal Chinese people about whether this is some political rumbling far away from them or whether they feel a change in atmosphere too?
Well, it's hard to answer. I left Beijing about 8 months ago, and I'm always reticent to talk about what Chinese people think but from my sort of small circle of friends, and many of whom I still talk to on WeChat, there's definitely a sense that things have changed and not for the better in terms of speech, the internet, et cetera. Back to your other question, I think you're very correct to point out sort of the way U.S. policy has basically stayed in a specific band. Certainly, one of the things that I've noticed being back here was a lot more questioning of the basic premise of engagement with China and whether that makes sense. At the same time, I think you're seeing that to some extent in China, because a lot of the crackdown we're seeing, and don't make no mistake, this is probably the biggest ideological crackdown since the Tiananmen Square in 1989, is I think you could argue in some ways it's a reaction to the success of the engagement policy. And so one of the questions would be from the US side is, do we then change the policy because it's going the wrong direction in China, or do we double down because they think it's going the wrong direction too from their perspective?
And just to reassure you all, we're going to get to a what do we do round of questions later. But I'm going to now ask Michael about another visible aspect of apparent change is military policy in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. And there have been a lot of hypotheses in the U.S. about the danger of sort of unintentional spiraling conflict. How do you see the change in Chinese behavior there and this possibility of unintentional escalation?
There are debates about this. Some people will argue these are just a bunch of rocks. Why should we care whether the Philippines can control them or Japan can control them? And the answer is we should care, because this is about fundamentally how order is sustained in Asia. And the islands that run from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines, the so-called First Island chain, have not been under contest since World War II. And from the perspective of all those countries I just mentioned, China is now trying to incrementally establish dominance. So this is a much larger thing than a bunch of rocks. But because it's a bunch of rocks and there are a lot of ships on all sides, there is a danger of an accidental collision or conflict. Less likely to be our planes or our ships, more likely to be the Philippines or Japan. The answer to that is not stand back. The answer to that, I think, is work with the Philippines and Japan, make them feel more secure, have a little more control over where this goes, and demonstrate to Beijing that we want a good relationship, but we're not going to tolerate coercion against traditional allies or friends in the region. And do you think, for example, The Atlantic had a great article a few months ago by Graham Allison of Harvard about the Thucydides trap of each nation talking itself into a showdown? Is that something you spend time worrying about or not? Not too much. I testified with Graham in the Senate on this actually not too long ago. I think to your earlier question, President Obama actually had one of the best lines about U.S.-China policy. He said, China has a stake in the U.S. success, and the U.S. has a stake in China's success. That's been the underlying theme since Nixon. That hasn't changed. What has changed is Xi Jinping is the first leader since Deng who was not picked by Deng. His frame for China's foreign policy is not Dengist. It's not hide, bide your time, lay low. It's quite ambitious. And we're going to have to contend with that for the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah. So just as a sort of place marker for what we've been hearing for the last few minutes, let's remark that we heard from Jonathan that this is an adolescent economy and sometimes they crash the car. We heard from Deborah, this was a game-changing leader. We heard from Bill, this was the most significant crackdown since Tiananmen, and we just heard from Michael that there's a real change from Dengist foreign policy. There's a real moment of transition going on here. If you match what you all have been talking about with your China experience for the last few minutes with the tone of American public discourse in a presidential year, essentially the only argument is how much is China screwing us really? That's the difference among political candidates. The real U.S. policy since Nixon has been, we do have a stake in China's success, and it's better for the U.S. if China prospers than not. How does one, if one of you were on the panel right now with, let's say, Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or anybody else saying, we got to really take back these things China has stolen from us. Jonathan, what would you argue back?
That would be too much fun. He's actually right over there.
I know.
I think he said stolen what? It's like those manufacturing jobs. I don't know where they went, but they didn't go to China. China's manufacturing employment has been flat for the last decade. This is a capital labor substitution. It's what happens when your domestic demand collapses, your manufacturing goes with it.
But to be fair, over a 25-year period, China did become a manufacturing outsourcer.
China became a manufacturing exporter. 60% of the exports from China are from U.S. company, from foreign invested enterprises. So it's us doing stuff for us.
Right.
And that is an interesting question. That is a broader question about how should corporations be operated, and should the government tell corporations what to do? That would be a great conversation to have.
And so I'll now ask Michael, as a person with more of your recent life in D.C. than Jonathan has had, how would you engage the political argument that China is just a wholly negative force for the U.S. economy and U.S. interests?
I was involved in a series of failing Republican presidential campaigns after I left the Bush White House. And the previous election was quite interesting because, as you recall, Governor Romney really went at China exchange rate and stopped. And part of the reason was because swing states like Ohio export a lot, especially agricultural goods, and it wasn't polling well. So my main answer would be look at the polls a little more carefully, especially state by state, especially swing states, and you'll see there's a lot more dependence on China. But I would also say to Donald Trump, if you're so worried about China, stop beating up Japan and Korea. And I would say to Hillary Clinton, if you're so worried about China, support TPP, because that's how the next administration will get leverage for negotiations to take care of the problems we have with China. But I think the Chinese are used to this kind of discourse in Washington around this time of year, and we'll see how quickly we recover from it, but they've seen this play before.
And so, Deborah, Michael queued up the topic of TPP, which on a pan-party basis now is seen as this toxic thing nobody wants to endorse. Tell me how you see it and how you think it's seen in China and the rest of Asia.
Sure. Well, I served in the Bush and the Clinton administrations and was involved in some of the early trade negotiations that we did with China. And it hasn't been since China's WTO accession that we've actually engaged them seriously on trade since. We haven't had a major trade agreement. We've started a bilateral investment treaty recently. So if you look at the four candidates, it's astonishing to see that they're so anti-trade when you look at the benefits, not just to China, but to the United States and to American companies that came out of the WTO. And I would argue that there's a real benefit in both the TPP as a way to leverage China, which is very interested in participating and would force them to consider some very serious challenges that they would need to make internally to try and meet that, but also to be pushing really aggressively to get a bilateral investment treaty, that is going to benefit China and the United States. And the benefit also of it, going back to the arguments that we were making earlier about the politicians making the decisions, is these kinds of trade agreements actually support the reformers in China who we should be interested in supporting, because whether we like it or not, we do have a big stake in China's success, and we benefit when they do well economically.
And do you agree with my impression from traveling in Asia that in the rest of Asia, including China, TPP is seen as a clear increase in U.S. leverage relative to China's over the rest of Asia? Is that your impression? Yeah,
definitely.
Not how it's seen here. One other point, just before I turn to Bill, talking about, you all have been talking about the Midwest. It really struck me in spending time in southern China in a lot of the manufacturing areas, how many of the other Americans in the hotels were from Ohio, from Wisconsin, from Michigan, from Illinois, that went back and forth and had all their connections there. Bill, how do you, when you come back to an America that's somewhat nervous about things in general in China, how do you tell them to think about China's pernicious zero-sum relationship with the U.S.?
Well, again, it's a very complex relationship. I think, was it the Rhodium Group, Dan Rosen had a good report recently. There was something like Chinese investment in, I think, 80+% of the congressional districts in America. And so to the earlier point, there's lots of positives with this trade and investment from China. But I do think that, as Deborah said, she is a game changer. And so there has to be, I think, a bit of a reassessment of some of the fundamental assumptions we've made about where China is headed and how our engagement with China is ultimately going to change China. Because I think our engagement with China has changed China, but it's not changing China into necessarily the thing that we want it to become, and into, I think, potentially much more of a strategic competitor.
So let me extend that. You say reassess what we're doing, what they're becoming. What exactly do you mean? How would you, if you were conducting that reassessment now, what would it lead you to think, and what should we do about it?
Well, that's the hard part of the answer.
That's why
Right. No, I know. I think that, there has to be a bit more of a appreciation for the Chinese zero-sum approach to trade, and a bit more pushback on some of the trade issues. I think you saw U.S. Steel is leading the charge today or yesterday. I think more of those cases should be brought. I think there does need to be more focus on some of the national security aspects. So things like CFIUS and its review of deals is something that I think makes a lot of sense, and we probably should see more of that. When you look at the high-tech sector, China has, undersea, they've had this plan for a long time to build themselves into a high-tech powerhouse, but undersea in the last year, they've really reiterated their desire to build up a sort of have a semiconductor industry that rivals the United States. So I think there needs to be more scrutiny of the deals that China's looking at in terms of the semiconductor industry. On the media side, U.S. companies are basically blocked from investing in China, but you have Chinese own the largest movie chain. They own, they're investing in lots of movie studios. They're probably going to start investing in the internet. I'm not advocating sort of a Reds under the bed kind of approach, but I think there needs to be a clear-eyed view of what's going on and some inequities or disparities in the relationship.
So let's engage Jonathan and Deborah directly on what Bill is saying. He's been talking about being more aware of a zero-sum approach to trade, about of having ways to sort of impose more penalties for things we don't like. Jonathan, would you recognize, how would you answer the idea there's a zero-sum approach to trade that we should be more wary of?
Well, I guess a couple thoughts. One is, I'm not quite there to say Xi Jinping's a game changer. I think that he is the first president of China who actually had his dad also be a powerful person. Yeah. And so this is the first person who has to look up to his father's legacy in recent. Does that strike anybody's remembrance? So,
it doesn't really lead in positive
there might be some, as I said, dysfunctionality here. So that is fair. But as I said, I started at the beginning. These are really, really long-term trends, and I don't think the Chinese national government is all that proactive. I think it just tries to barely keep up with what China is doing. And China is urbanizing, and China's people are getting rich, and China's people are complaining like you wouldn't believe about everything. There is no faith in the tomorrow for Chinese people. They want it now. And so the Chinese government is basically sort of paddling as hard as it can to respond to all of that. Now, this question, is it zero-sum? Yeah, I don't know. I think that it's certainly very transactional. I think Chinese trade policy has always been very transactional. You should see back in the day where you would Chinese trade negotiator would line up 17 companies and go through, his price was this, what's yours? His price was this, what's yours? His price was this. It's very transactional. So always been that way. I think the U.S. policy should likewise be consistent. Should be consistent around market opening, should be consistent around the enablement of a productive private sector in the Chinese economy, and should be consistent around the rights and responsibilities of the individual in Chinese society. And those 3 points, the individual, the company, and the market opening policies, they have been the bedrock of U.S. attitudes towards China, and we should continue to do that.
Deborah, agree? Which of these two gentlemen do you agree with more?
Oh, well, I don't know about more. I agree with a lot of points of both of them. And I think going to Jonathan's analogy of them being sort of as a teenager coming out, dealing with two teenagers of my own, they deal best when the rules are very clear and you stick to them. And I think going to this issue of transparency and being clear what the rules are. And we lose sight sometimes of the fact that we have a lot of leverage still with China. There's a lot of things that they want from us, both in terms of respectability of our market. If Xi is going to make a lot of the changes that he needs to do, he can't afford to have a big battle with the United States, whether it's on trade or the military or some of these other issues. Small ones maybe because they may work for propaganda purposes, but he needs the consistency of growth in his economy to be able to make the changes. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to push the Chinese, and I think there are some things that we should be more aggressive about doing. They certainly don't hesitate when it comes to our market. If you look at anti-dumping cases, we will bring them, and I hope I'm not going to offend anyone, but they tend to be in industries here in the US that aren't our cutting-edge industries. Whereas what China does is it looks very politically in retaliation at some of the top export markets and decides that's where they're going to bring their cases so that they have some leverage over our markets. And thinking strategically about how we're using some of the rules that we have at our fingertips, but also where we might introduce others. For example, we were discussing earlier about when we were in the Clinton, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations looking at Japan, even though they were members of the WTO, we still were dealing with them on a bilateral trade basis to try and bring about certain changes, even if we didn't have some of the trade tools available we used our leverage to do that. And there's certainly ways to be engaging with China on the same thing. And if you're not engaging on some of these issues, if we're not engaged on a bilateral investment treaty, for example, we aren't creating both positive momentum, but we're also not creating leverage.
So I have going to move to a series of lightning round type questions. We'll go in order and see if it get like a sentence or two answer from each of you and see if we can get through several rounds of these. First involves knowledge of China. What impressed me most in the about 4 years we lived there was the vastness of the place, its contradictoriness, how one thing you saw here told you nothing about what's happening other places. How would you apportion, I'll start with Bill, what is knowable and what you still view as basically just unknowable about China? What to you is unknowable about China?
Well, right now, the politics. The politics have always been a black box. They're a much blacker box right now. I also think the general premise, sort of the quote-unquote China expert, is a very fallacious view, because just like would you trust an America expert? Underselling myself, right? But to be perfectly honest, it's such, as you wrote so eloquently so often, it is just such a diverse and complex place that it is, in many ways, it really is unknowable. Yeah.
Deborah, your unknowability.
Well, I would totally agree with that it's very difficult to call yourself a China expert because there's so many different things that you're not going to know about. And I think as we look at, again, picking up on one of Jonathan's themes, I think one of the biggest challenges that Xi Jinping has is that it's unknowable in some ways for him, and that he doesn't actually have the levers of government to rule on a consistent basis to ensure that any policies that he makes at a central level are actually implemented on a consistent basis by a local mayor or a governor. And that's a very scary feeling.
Michael, unknowability.
Decision-making at the top, not just on the economy, but on security, and especially in a crisis. I was in the George W. Bush White House when the EP-3 crisis happened. One of our planes was rammed by one of their planes. Jiang Zemin wouldn't pick up the phone call after 12 attempts. President Bush finally tracked him down in Latin America and got another leader to put him on the phone. It's not much better today. The opaqueness is a problem across the board, but in an acute crisis, it's worrying.
Jonathan.
I think we agree on the politics. My political science joke is when people studied the Soviet Union learned to hate the Soviet Union, when they studied China, they learned to hate themselves. I add one thing to that. I think the geography is true. It's a continent, not a country. And last point, culture. I'm not Chinese. And without being 4,000 years of DNA in the Chinese culture, you just don't get it. I mean, we come out of a different philosophical tradition. And so the responses, how people will gut reaction to something, that's not something you can get unless you actually are Chinese.
On the comparison with the Soviet Union, my impression is that most people who spent time in China, while they hate many things about it, they love the experience and really enjoy most of the people. Next lightning round. My premise in writing has been the gravest threat to the Chinese entity's survival is pollution and sustainability in all forms. Therefore, there should be an avenue of our working together. Agree, disagree? What would you have as a bigger threat than pollution?
I would agree. I think if you look at actually a bigger threat than the air is both the water and the soil. The water is, I mean, there are cities that really may run out of water in the next 30, 40 years, including Beijing potentially, and they're just undertaking a new soil survey. The last one they did was not complete and was classified. And I think the extent of I mean, they have multiple environmental disasters on a scale that we've never experienced in the U.S.
Cancer villages, et cetera. Yes. Deborah, environment or any other existential threat?
No, I agree. And although as one Chinese official explained to me in that equation that they have to breathe the air, they can grow food other places or get it other sources and get water from other sources. So politically, the air is the most complicated for them, I think. But I would predict that this is their potential competitive advantage given all the investment they're putting into renewables and other issues related to the environment.
Michael, your sense of existential threat?
I think water, especially, but all issues associated with climate change and pollution are at the top of a list of issues, including nationalism, religion, and so forth, that threaten the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, which ultimately, for the regime, for the party, is an issue of real concern.
I think I'm closer to Michael, actually. I mean, I think sustainability for China is an obvious thing, but I hesitate to call it a threat. I think they would view it as an opportunity. When I talked to the head of the NDRC, he says, we had desertification in Beijing, and now we've got smog. So, okay, if we spent a lot of money then, we'll spend a lot of money now. So that doesn't challenge them. What I do think challenges them is technology and the unintended consequences of its deployment, whether it's through information or it's through changing the nature of the job. I mean, there is going to be no more industrial revolution for China in the job sense. We're not going to have another 100 million manufacturing jobs. These people are all going to have to become, God forbid, political economists or accountants or journalists. There's going to be a disruption, and that's going to change their society in an existential way, to your point about the governance structure.
So this is my last lightning round question, then I'll invite questions from the audience. I always wondered when seeing the heavy-handedness of various kind of Chinese officials in cracking down on the internet or speech or whatever, from my perspective, it seemed an irrational response. So I often wondered, is it a matter of their knowing less than I do about how much their people could actually take, or do they know more than I do about the threats to continued Communist Party success? So Jonathan, I'll start with you this time. Do they know more than I do about the fragility of their hold on power? And then the follow-up is, what are the odds of Communist Party leadership 20 years from now, starting at 100 and going to some lower number?
I think it's an emotional response,
Yeah.
Because these are fundamental premises of the way society is supposed to work. It's supposed to be hierarchical Confucian. The person at the top is supposed to be a better person. And when you actually question that, then you get an emotional response, unlike in the West, where we sort of assume that everybody's basically the same and that we all put our pants on one leg at a time in the morning. So it's kind of, there's competition of ideas. China's not like that. There's an unspoken assumption around the hierarchy. So you question it, you get a random response. And so to what extent do I think that'll change? I can't see how China becomes. I think China with urban characteristics is a different China. So I would say on a 100 scale that the governance model has to evolve. Whether we're going to wind up still calling it communist or not, I don't know. But it's not going to look anything like it is today, and that would be 100 out of 100.
Yeah. Michael.
Well, they know a lot more than you know because
Yes.
they have tens and tens of thousands of officials in the Ministry of State Security monitoring the internet. So just in terms of volume of information, you lose.
Yeah.
But what's always struck me, especially since I left government, interacting with Chinese scholars and joint research, is how few windows they have on their own people. We'll do research and I'll employ public opinion polls. China scholars don't. We have elections, we have by-elections, we have a free media. There's so many ways to monitor where the American people are, and it strikes me how blind, in a way, Chinese leaders are about where their own society and people really are. And always, this is not just the Chinese Communist Party. This has always been true of China. And that's got to keep you up at night.
Yeah. So, Deborah, how do you stand on this? Is their repression rational, irrational, blind, instinctive, and will they still be in power?
I think that on the repression, it's all of the above. I think there are elements of paranoia. There are elements that are true. China tends to be a very rumor-oriented society, and when you have a following of 500 million bloggers, and you start to put out things that aren't necessarily accurate, whether it's criticisms or not, but just things about the economy, it can have a very powerful impact. And Chinese people now, through the internet and through other sources of social media, actually have become a very powerful force, for good and sometimes for bad, as foreign investment companies have gone in, some of the chemical companies, and wanting to set up plants in certain cities, and people have mobilized against it, they've actually stopped that investment. And it's not always been based on a factual reason. So I would say it's all of the above, but certainly the repression is a lot worse than it used to be. I would agree with Jonathan that one of Xi's big challenges is that he does want to rule through the party, and he has to clean up an exceedingly corrupt party that's the size of the population of Germany. It's a huge task. And China's going to look very different in 10 to 15 years through evolution of the party and how he's going to get these levers of power that he needs to actually implement his policies.
Bill, last word for you.
So I think that they know a lot. What I had heard under the last administration was that each of the Politburo Standing Committee members, among their cadre of secretaries, they each had a social media secretary who every day had a brief on what was going on online. In many ways, what you're seeing, I think, was Xi's policies over the internet, and he gave a very important, as his speeches are always important, but this one was actually important, speech last week about the internet. They're in many ways evolutionary and very consistent with the way the party's been trying to work the internet over the last decade or so, which is very clear. They want to harness it for the economic benefits and the governance benefits while controlling public opinion. And you got to remember, this is a communist party, and one of its pillars of rule is ideological control and propaganda work. And so the internet, and specifically social media, had disintermediated the party propaganda apparatus from its ability from the people, and they were in a position of, the party was in a position of actually reacting as opposed to setting the agenda, which is nothing, no party likes that, especially the Communist Party. In terms of paranoia, the party has always been paranoid. The party has always seen threats everywhere. So the fact that they seem paranoid now, is it necessarily an indication that things are worse than they were 5 or 10 or 15 years ago? As to where the party's going, Mark Zuckerberg would certainly recommend Xi's book on the governance of China. I think in there, though, he does lay out a vision for how he wants the party to evolve, and it may be something that's not going to be achieved, but if it is achieved, I think the odds are relatively high, well above 50%, that 20 years from now, that something called the Communist Party will still be running China.
Great. So a question, yes, sir, in this shirt here. Yes. I'll take somebody on this side. We have time for probably 2 questions.
Yeah, I'm Jed Schilling with the Millennium Institute. This has been very interesting. And I have a question about the substantial amount of Chinese investment in the U.S. and U.S. industries, what the implications are for the economic relations between China and the U.S., and also the implications for the political security issues of this fairly substantial and growing level of investment from China into the U.S.
So Deborah, why don't you start with that, and then Michael, and then, yeah.
Well, I think the more trade and investment that we have between our countries, the closer it brings us together, the harder it is for us to have conflict, and the more incentive we have to try and resolve them.
When Jim Fallows and I were in Japan many moons ago, the U.S.-Japan relationship was terrible. The effect of huge foreign direct investment turned around American opinions of Japan because it created steady, reliable jobs. So it could have a positive political impact, but China's investment is going to be different, and there are going to be restrictions. So I'm not sure how positive it will end up being in the end.
So a lot of it's from private industry as opposed to state-owned, which I think will have somewhat of a different twist to it.
So, yes, in the back, yes.
Linda Lubaire, Morgan State University. Does feminism play any part in the changes that you see going on in China? If so, what are they? And if not, why not?
Who would like to start? So how about Deborah, then Jonathan? Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. I've actually never thought about that question. Certainly, I started negotiating with the Chinese over 20 years ago. The biggest challenges I found were never from the Chinese. They actually were for the foreign expat community, as being a woman negotiating over there. But there were only a few women when we started doing the negotiations, and they had a very difficult time, and very few, as you will see, looking at the leadership. There's only one woman, a vice premier, in the top leadership. But at the younger generations, it's definitely changing. And we're seeing a lot more people coming up, and certainly in the private sector, where it's been more difficult for women to rise up through the government, there are a large number of them, and there's a large number of women reporters. And I think that's been a very interesting dynamic in terms of some of the reporting that's been coming out. They've been very tenacious, and probably the most famous reporter and the most bold reporter is a woman of a magazine called CSIS, who does a lot of reporting on the anti-corruption campaigns.
Jonathan.
Yeah, and McKinsey Global Institute just came out with a global report on gender parity. So I think that we find in China's actually pretty good, and when it comes to the total share of GDP is 41% roughly from China, from women versus men, which is pretty high. U.S. is, I think, almost is like 38 or 39, so it's a little bit better. Same levers, though, essentially around full versus part-time versus a mix of the job and sort of how much and what value-added part of the economy, and of course participation rates. So I think there's there's still work to be done. Attitudes in many cases need to be shifted around leadership, as you're saying. Sort of if you do the polling, you get sort of really retrograde kind of feelings about who should be entitled to be in jobs when jobs are scarce, or who makes a good leader. But still this process of urbanization has in many ways created the whole dynamic around saying you can have a different life. You do not have to have the life that your parents, your grandparents had. You don't have to not go to school. You don't have to marry the person that I told you to marry. You can redefine yourself, and Factory Girls from Leslie Chang is the best recommendation I can give.
So, yeah, go ahead, Bill.
There's one point on that. Last year there were 5 feminists who were detained.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were detained because they were feminists. I think it was because they were actually trying to organize online and across geographies, which is sort of hits all of the Communist
Right.
Party's
And it's like
pressure points.
religions aren't oppressed because of the religion, it's because of the organization.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, up in the front, please.
Okay. Philippe, excuse me, Philippe Burke at Apache Capital. Thank you. Yeah, I had a question about environmental degradation. And in particular, there was a study that came out, I'm going to say maybe 3-4 years ago by the World Bank, where they estimated the amount of consumption of the natural capital of China that occurs in order to create their roughly 7% weighted average economic growth in the last 10, 15 years. And that number came out to about 8 to 10% of GDP, which is very interesting because if those numbers are anywhere near true, China is actually getting poorer and poorer year after year. And I'm just wondering, is there a sense anywhere in government that if these numbers are true, and apparently they were replicated at the university, at Beijing University, if those numbers are anywhere near true, is there a debate, internal debate, that maybe this rush for growth and the destruction of the environment is actually a lousy deal?
And this will be our last round of answers for like 20 or 30 seconds each. Jonathan, you were suggesting that they viewed it as a manageable thing. I'm suggesting it's more existential, as this question would suggest too. What's your response?
I think they understand the threat, and I think they are prepared to invest against it. There's no country that's made a bigger commitment to energy efficiency, to renewable energies, to mass transit than China, and that's an opportunity. So this is a great industry for China. The cleaning up is always a great industry. This is a particularly good one.
Michael.
I think there's some room for optimism on the pollution front, but I'm with Bill. I think water is very serious, both in terms of domestic growth and legitimacy, but also because China will have to dam rivers that run into Bangladesh, India, Cambodia, Vietnam, and that becomes a geopolitical problem.
Yeah.
There's no question that the Chinese government has recognized that they need to change how they've been growing. And in fact, they have linked promotion of mayors and governors to their performance on the environment. Goldman Sachs did a study where they estimated that the opportunities of it were $1 trillion for private business. So it is a great opportunity. The question will be, as China's growth continues to slow, will they still continue to invest in the environment?
Bill, last word
And
to
it's a
you.
political problem, right? Because how do you tell the provincial governor or the mayor who's part of their evaluation is based on growth that they have to clean things up? And so we need to see a better realignment of incentives within the party system about how people get promoted. That has sort of happened, but not as much as people wanted to. And one of the things that would be a great indicator is if the Chinese government were to get rid of their GDP target. And we had hoped that would happen after the third plenum in 2013. Hasn't happened, I think, because politically the system is so geared towards GDP targets and how they feed in promotions that it's it's a political problem. It's very difficult to change.
We've learned a lot in these last 40 minutes, so please join me in thanking Jonathan, Michael, Deborah, and Bill.
Thanks, Jim. That's great. You're a great moderator. Thank you. Wow.